And joining us now to talk about Canada's Navy, on the line from our nation's capital, it's Vice-Admiral Dean McFadden. He is the Chief of Maritime Staff and Commander of the Canadian Navy. And Vice-Admiral, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me this evening, Steve.
Not at all. I want to start by reading something that was in the Toronto Star recently about the status of the Navy today. It goes like this. An annual assessment by McFadden's predecessor, former Vice-Admiral Drew Robertson, painted an alarming picture of a force scrambling to crew missions and keep ships at sea. It estimated the Navy was short 954 sailors out of 8,000 plus regular personnel. Some warships have gone to sea at 13% below established crew guidelines. And I guess my first question is, do you think the Navy has a personnel crisis on its hands?
Steve, I wouldn't disagree with anything that Drew had said. In fact, we talked about it fairly extensively over the last year. I think crisis is too big a word, but I have no doubt that there's a problem, there's an issue that I need to come to grips with. You know, we had a former Chief of Defence Staff who would, I think, first time used the term a hollowed out force. We've done a lot of work in the Canadian Forces to address that difficulty over the last 5 years. And there's no doubt we've gone a long way to making that much better. But I don't think there's any doubt that the very significant mission that we're involved in Afghanistan has meant that we've needed to make decisions and prioritize. And I think we have done a very effective job of growing our capacity to conduct land operations supported by air mobility capabilities. One of the things that we have not done as well, and so whilst the force has grown over the past 5 years, the Navy's gotten smaller.
Okay, let me follow up on that for a second.
That's because of where we've had priorities, but it's also because we haven't done a good enough job explaining to people what we're about.
Okay, Vice, and that's part of the reason you're here today, because we're going to find out more about what you do. But if crisis is the wrong word, let's find out what the right word is, because as you know, the HMCS Ville de Québec recently completed a tour of the Great Lakes in hopes of finding new recruits. What does that say about just how tough your recruiting situation is?
Well, I think sending Ville de Québec into the lakes, not the first time that we've done that, but to send it in primarily and making sure that we're using that opportunity to connect with Canadians in ways that we have just not been good enough in the past, explaining what their Navy's about, what its capabilities are, what work within the Navy affords, what type of activities we're involved in. We need to do a better job in getting out and explaining to Canadians what maritime capability is about and why it's critical to them. And, you know, there's no doubt that we've put a lot of attention on that. And I'll tell you that it's a little early for me to say yet that, you know, we're no longer in shoal waters. But one of the problems in the last 5 years is that we fell short of reaching our targets. This year, we're about 8.5% as of the end of September, ahead of our target for this year. And that's almost a 19% improvement over where we were this time last year. And so we need to take a whole bunch of responsibility ourselves for doing a better job explaining what the whole of the Canadian Forces are about, not simply the specific and very difficult mission in which we're involved at the moment.
Okay, so that's personnel. Let's talk equipment for a second. The Navy, of course, still uses Sea King helicopters. Some of the support ships are 40 years old. Until recently, the Victoria-class submarines bought from the British were being repaired. How dire would you say the Navy's need for new equipment is right now?
Again, tough word to say dire. We are still operating some of the best, most combat-capable equipment in the world. But there is a plan, Canada First Defence Strategy, that lays out for us the type of recapitalization that we need to do. And that is an extraordinarily ambitious program. But we're already started into it. The workhorse of the Canadian fleet is the Canadian Patrol Frigate. And so we have already started the process of modernizing those ships, which are all about 15 years old now. We are at the stage of, I think, starting to see the submarine capability in 2010 starting to pay dividends on the very substantial investment that we've made in it. Sea King helicopters. By the end of this year, we'll see the first of the Cyclone helicopters actually operating on the East Coast, and we'll start the integration of that helicopter with the frigate. We have already initiated and need to get on and do it, replacing the support vessels. We also have programs to be able to ensure that what we're able to do is operate in our own ocean environments in ways, I think, far broader than we've done in the past. And so that's the Arctic and offshore patrol ship, to operate not just in the Arctic, but also to develop the capability to go there. Plans to modernize the Aurora aircraft and look at the multi-mission maritime patrol after that. And we're already started in the process of where do we go beyond the frigates. And so, you know, certainly for the first time in my professional life at the level where I worried about it, as opposed to simply taking ships to sea, I see a plan laid out as to how we are going to recapitalize the Navy. How we do that, I have no doubt. There's lots of issues we need to work through in doing it. There are very long lead times to bring capital equipment online. But instead of us discussing whether we should or we shouldn't, we know what we need to get on with. And one of the jobs that I have to do is not simply increasing the size of the base of the Navy, in other words, recruiting, doing a better job of talking to Canadians about why that work is critical to them. I need to get more of our people into doing work that we haven't done for a very long time. And that's developing the Navy, getting into the project development and the work to bring a new fleet into being over the next 20, 25 years.
Okay, let's talk. We've talked personnel, we've talked equipment. Let's talk, I guess I can put it this way, new responsibilities. During the Cold War, having a large Navy made sense for fighting conventional wars, and I want to know today what role the Navy has in a sort of post-Cold War, more insurgency-style kind of world in which we live today.
Okay. I go right back to the policy that guides why we maintain a Canadian forces to the degree that we can. Primarily, job one, defense of Canada. We also must be an effective partner in contributing to continental defense. And we must also maintain a capability to support international peace and security operations with a capability to lead in doing those things. Canadians have done a very, very good job of much of the heavy lifting in many places that we go. One of the things I think we need to ensure we have a capacity to do as we move into the future is ensure that what you're not getting is simply Canadians to do the heavy lifting jobs at the end of the pipeline, but involved in the process of figuring out not how it gets done, but what jobs need to be done, why we send ships on missions. And so a leadership role in those international operations allows us to bring more Canada to the world, and I think that's a good thing. But what has changed? To tell you the truth, from a Navy's perspective, although we may not have realized at the time, the Cold War was the anomaly. We're back to the future of, certainly in the maritime world, of what navies have always been about. Just looking at a country like Canada, we have a vast ocean estate over which we exercise jurisdiction. That's not just the Navy. That's all of the federal maritime capacities that are brought to bear. But I think people need to understand the size of that. You know, that's the ocean estate over which Canada claims jurisdiction is about 70% the size of the land mass of Canada, and we're a huge country. We've got the world's longest coastline. I think we probably have the second largest continental shelf where most of the riches of the ocean reside. And we've probably got about the fourth or fifth exclusive economic zone. And I suppose even using that word, we've seen more change in the regulatory regime governing the oceans of the world, more change in that regime in the last 30 years than there were in the previous 300. Coastal states extending their jurisdictions onto the oceans. And that brings with it what must be the means by which differences of opinion, disputes, not necessarily conflict, but those disputes need to be resolved. We're seeing that ourselves today in in what is a very rapidly changing third ocean environment into which the Navy must deploy and operate far more in the future than we did in the past. So into the Arctic. But the Arctic's almost a parable of some of the changes that are going on worldwide. Canadians almost viscerally, culturally, realize that what we have is a responsibility for the Arctic, to be guardians, stewardship, to make sure that it's
Well, could I follow up on that? Let me follow up on that, because, of course, the Americans and the Russians dispute our Arctic claims, and they occasionally send their ships up there unannounced just to remind us that they don't really respect our claims on that territory. Considering that they have, I think it's fair to say, considerable naval superiority over us, is there anything you can really do to stop them from doing that?
Sure we can. And so when you say there are disputes over claims, realize there's no dispute who owns all of the islands. There's no dispute as to who has regulatory authority over the water. All of that is the sovereign responsibility of Canada. There are some boundary disputes with respect to where we would draw the line between ourselves and the United States, and the status of the right of people to be able to have passage through the waters. But there's no doubt that the responsibility as to how that area needs to be regulated from Canada's position, that's our sovereign responsibility. And to be able to exercise that responsibility, you have to go. You have to establish presence. You have to be able to surveil that area so as you know what's going on.
All true, but we're never going to be as big as they are. So how do we make our presence felt and let them know that those are our waters?
Well, I think you're seeing certainly very substantial attempts for us to develop the capabilities to do that. We do need to put more surveillance capability in place, and so to some degree there will be more satellite surveillance to do that. We need to put sensors into our waters so as we know what's going on. And we also need to build ships that are capable of operating there. The Navy will have a role in that, but I'm always very careful to explain to people the role that the Navy will fulfill in the Arctic is no different than the role we're fulfilling in the Atlantic and Pacific approaches at the moment. This is not about militarizing the North. It's about doing the same job of ensuring that we support, by surveillance, by an understanding of what's going on, and as necessary, supporting enforcement. But it's the regulatory authority of other agencies, the police, the border services, fisheries and oceans, and the Coast Guard with respect to environmental compliance. But what sovereign authority means is you make the rule sets and you ensure that people follow those rule sets. The reason why this is of critical importance to the country at the moment is because that environment is rapidly changing. We exercise that authority in our Atlantic and Pacific approaches, and we will develop the capability to do it in the third ocean space that's starting to look more and more like ocean than like frozen land.
No, fair enough, fair enough. But let me ask you this. Obviously, there's been a great deal of emphasis placed lately by the Canadian government and reflected in the media of the government's importance, newfound importance that they're putting on the Arctic. It's clearly a priority for them. Is it a priority for the Navy as well? Would you say that's job one?
Canadian government tells me that defense of Canada is job one. That means it is job one for the Navy. The difficulty, I think, is that people want to see the world as a black and white world. It doesn't mean that there aren't a whole bunch of other responsibilities that I need to ensure we can effectively address as well. But have no doubt, Canada First defense strategy means that we will ensure we develop the capability to surveil, to understand what's going on, to establish far better domain awareness, and in our case that's the maritime domain, in the approaches to this country in all three of the ocean estates that we have. That is an enormous task, which means we need to set our foot to that path and get on and do it.
Okay, Vice-Admiral.
But it doesn't mean that we don't have responsibilities to contribute to what are problems that I think Canadians have not only a passing interest in, but must ensure that we have the capability to contribute to make the entire ocean space of this world one that can be used for the free movement of goods and services. A country like Canada understands that this is a globally connected world. When you look at Canadians, at the composition of our societies, you know this is a globally connected world. The oceans carry 90% of the goods that move, that are the commodities upon which the global commerce is based, move by water. We need to make sure that as disputes arise, as we have boundary difficulties which regulatory regimes bring to the forefront, and that those that would use the seas for ways that are not either in accordance with regulation or appropriate, there are means that we have to be able to ensure it's the free movement of goods and services upon lawful occasions. Our Navy needs to have the capability to do that because Canada is connected globally. 40% of our economy, of the GDP, is at the moment based upon exports by sea. And that number's rising. There's no doubt we're a globally connected country. And so I hear people talk about a home game and an away game. If you're a sailor, there's only one game, and the whole of the world's ocean space is connected. Sometimes we play defense, sometimes we support the playing of offense. That doesn't mean massively threatening and being coercive and projecting power onto other countries' territories. It may mean that you operate in coalitions and in alliances to ensure that the oceans are used for proper purposes and that their movement upon that ocean space is not restricted. It's, for example, what, and only one way, an operation in counter-piracy is about, to making sure that what we don't see is commerce, people going about their lawful business, being threatened, being harmed, and those global connections being affected. We need to operate in our own ocean space and at the far end of the world. And that is a globally deployable Navy. To tell you the truth, that's what I see being laid out in the Canada First Defence Strategy. That's what we need to get on and make happen.
Vice Admiral, that's our time tonight. Thanks for joining us on TVO.
Now, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity. Good night.